Teachers of Reddit, what's the most clever attempt from a student at giving a technically correct answer to a question you have seen? Student obviously not paying attention. Joshua, what was the last word I said? Ooh. Said. Environmental science class. A test question said, where do most shark attacks occur? A student wrote, in the water. The answer was neritic pelagic zone. I teach a college class on clinical trials methodology. After a lecture on endpoints where I described objective or hard endpoints, like a laboratory measurement versus more subjective or soft endpoints, like a survey that asks how you feel today, I assigned a homework that involved going out into the literature and finding examples of both. One student delivered all of their examples using erectile dysfunction clinical trials. I asked, what's the difference between a semicolon and a comma? A student didn't even take a beat before answering a dot. Not a teacher, but in high school we had a National Guard rep come talk to us. He asked, what does the National Guard do? I shouted out, guard the nation. Ended up getting a t-shirt out of it. Calculus. I a problem asked a student to estimate the square root of a certain integer, I think it was 19, and to give an upper and lower bound. They were supposed to use linear approximation in the problem. One student wrote down that it was greater than 1 and less than a billion. In subsequent semester I said explicitly to use linear approximation. Was teaching English at elementary school in Japan years ago. Pretty basic stuff: fruit, animals, food, sports, etc. Playing a game with 4 teams, you had to draw a picture on the board, pass the chalk to the next person, repeat. You only got points for things that you could name in English at the end of the game, bonus points for difficult words. Keep in mind the level here, basic nouns for very basic things. Come up to one, kids pick a rectangle with squiggles all over it. What is this? Picasso. Boom. I was teaching gardening ag at a magnet school in Kansas, and we were talking about composting worms, specifically red wrigglers. The class was probably 2nd grade, and I asked, what do we know about worms, to get the students thinking, and one little girl said very solemnly, they don't have Bibles. This is true. Worms don't have Bibles. Once during freshman year of high school we had a test about To Kill a Mockingbird, and one of the questions was, what is the significance behind Dill's name? I wrote down, because he's always in a pickle, and got it right. My neighbor is a physics teacher. She asked a student once what would happen if he jumped out of an airplane and there was no air pressure. His response was to ask how the plane got up there. I asked students in an English class to write sentences to practice their understanding of different parts of speech. I think my instructions said to use words from our vocabulary list and at least one action verb per sentence or something like that. One kid wrote variations of the verb jumped over the adjective at recess. I am a teacher, but this story is from a friend. Also not a clever retort, just childish innocence. He was teaching a group of kinders about hand washing and germs. Teacher, where might we find bacteria? Child, enthusiastically, Wisconsin. I mean, he wasn't wrong. Not a teacher, but I will never forget this happening in a class. We were going around the classroom saying what we would wish for, given 3 wishes. It was like the first week of class. The only rule was that you couldn't ask for more wishes. So it's going smooth, we are making it around the class, then my buddy gives his 3. No rules to infinite wishes 3. The teacher was like, wishing for more wishes was one of our rules, and with the most dead serious face imaginable he says, I wished for no rules, and that is not a rule. Everyone started laughing. To us it was the funniest thing all week. The teacher said in all the years they have asked that, not one student had ever wished for the rules to be removed so they could get more wishes. Was a good week. Not a teacher, but a friend of mine is. One time she gave a test on the book Great Expectations. The question asked something like, what were his expectations? One kid just answered, great. I teach English in Vietnam. The tests I give are usually verbal and made up from the school. I ask what their name is and listen to how they sound on one portion of the test. Then I ask them to spell it. I've been waiting for a long time for someone to do this, but someone finally responded with IT. I gave him extra credit on the paper, it doesn't mean anything, and made a comment about it on the test paper. This is one of the cool things about the school. They are encouraged to be creative. I had a teacher who would always have dumb extra credit questions. One was a true-false, where if it's false you cross out the word that makes it false and write in the correct word. This one was Mr. Teacher's favorite color is purple. Now, I figured false, which was correct, But I didn't know what the color was and knew he was looking for us to change the color. I changed the name to someone whose favorite color was purple. He didn't give me the points. I'm still bitter. I was a police instructor. And when I asked a new trainee what's something you cannot do to an already handcuffed suspect, I expected hit them or something. I called on a new trainee who was kind of shaky and he blurted out, "Ooh, put your fingers in their mouth, he's not wrong." I was that student once. In high school physics, our first lesson was that speed is relative. And our teacher held up a tennis ball or whatever and said he'd give a candy bar to anyone who could tell him how fast the ball was moving. We all obviously said it was standing still. To which he explained that the earth is spinning. So it's actually moving about 750 miles per hour, or whatever it was. And on top of it, the earth is rotating around the sun. The sun is moving as well. Etc., etc. So on our first test we had some real simple velocity-based questions, so in my math I added 750 miles per hour, or whatever it was, which made it a gigantic pain in the ass to grade. He gave me 100% on the agreement I wouldn't do it again. When I was in first grade, we were learning about rhyming and the teacher put us in groups of 2 and told us to come up with words that rhyme with our partner's name. Well, my partner's name was Tucker, and it took me a while to come up with something that rhymes with his name until I finally yelled out "fucker." Things went downhill very fast from there. I got sent to the principal's office, and my parents had to come to the school because my teacher was accusing me, a first grader, of sexual harassment for trying to rhyme with name Tucker. This one's kind of on point, in the spirit of a student doing something technically correct. When I was having my 4th grade kiddos write a persuasive essay on a topic of their choice, one girl in my class who despised writing essays came to me asking if she really had to do it. In talking with her, I noticed she came up with reasons to support her point pretty easily, so I told her to write them down. When she did that, I said if she could make it look professional, on essay paper she wouldn't have to do it. At the end of the week she was all smiles as she turned it in. I was really impressed and proud of her work, and she earned a great grade. Upon getting it back with everyone else's essays, she sat quietly for a second, then looked at me and said with a goofy frown, "You got me to do it anyway." I just smiled and nodded, yep. So in the end I had 31 essays on where their family should travel. 18 on what they think is the best pet. 13 on why the school should start a recycling program. And 1 on why they shouldn't have to write a persuasive essay. Not a teacher, but a former jock cadet inspecting younger cadets to pass them for a promotion. In 2016, during the presidential election, one of the questions for our promotion board was to name a presidential candidate other than Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or Bernie Sanders. I learned at the end of that day that only one kid got the other inspecting cadets to break their bearing with the answer of "these nuts," because at the time, he was correct. Back in middle school we were doing reading comprehension or whatever and determining if the given sentences were complete or not, and I pointed out that the minute "Scott heard his name called" was in fact a sentence about a very tiny guy named Scott hearing his name called, and had nothing to do with time. Was always proud of myself. Obviously I'm not a teacher. Not sure if it was clever or a misunderstanding, but I was a math teacher in an Asian country. We had a quiz and one question asked, define a linear relationship and give an example. One student wrote, when a boy and a girl are friends and like each other, for example my mom and dad. I guess that's right. In my college English class in Japan, a professor had an open anything that isn't connected to the internet test. One student brought an American. I was a teacher assistant and one of the jobs I had was to correct homework. One student had misunderstood the assignment. It was one of those "you have $10, what do you buy?" and you pick and choose from items on the sheet. But this girl made her own stuff. So she drew a cartoon of milk and a cheese with what they cost and the total is 10. It was beautiful made, so creative, and must have taken 7 times longer to complete than if she had done it right. So I wanted to give her everything right and a fucking star because this girl was a fucking champ. But no, the teacher made me give her wrong and she then showed the whole class what wrong she made and made her redo it. A small part of both mine and that girl's soul died that day. Edit. Wow, this got attention. It was not as simple as I wrote it. And it was in Swedish crowns, not dollars. But I usually write dollars when I write in English. She made 6 examples. So, one was milk and cheese. Another was a card, a toy car and a bouquet. The rest I don't remember, but she drew around 15 different things, gave them prices and matched it with the price the teacher was asking for. So yes, it was a whole lot of fucking work and she even colored them. She was 7. Not a teacher. One time in first grade we were given a paper with 6 lighthouses drawn onto it. We were told to color in half of the lighthouses. I colored in one half of each lighthouse. I mean the almonds thing. I was the student in this scenario. In high school we were watching a short film documentary about soldiers landing on a beach during World War II. I can't remember why, but I was sent out of the class to stand in the hallway for 5 minutes because I was being disruptive. When I was allowed back into class, the teacher paused the video almost immediately and asked, "What do you think those men saw as they were running onto the beach?" I immediately raised my hand. And when I was called upon, I responded, "Cameraman." I was sent to the dean's office for the remainder of that class. Student, "Can I use the bathroom?" Teacher, "I don't know, can you?" Student, "I don't know, haven't tried yet." In high school, for a chemistry final, we were able to bring in one 3x5 index card with notes for the test. Our teacher handed out written guidelines and this rule was included on the sheet. Fast forward to the day of the test, everyone is taking out their materials, and the kid sitting next to me unfolds a huge sheet of paper with basically every handout from the year stapled to it. Our teacher is like, "Yo, WTF, is that Steven?" And he whips out the test guideline sheet and says, "You didn't include units of measurement on the 3x5 index card." So Steven had constructed a 3-foot by 5-foot cheat sheet. Now keep in mind that this is chemistry and units are quite important, to the point of having points docked for forgetting them. Our teacher had a minor meltdown at her omission, realizing she would have to let him use it as his sheet technically fit the guidelines. I'm assuming he did well. I was a teacher a while back, but this was when I was a student. My English teacher passed out a quiz on Heart of Darkness, something my entire class agreed she never assigned. The questions were really easy if you had read the book, nothing about analyzing for symbolism or speaking about its themes, just comprehension. Problem was, I hadn't read it, and neither had anyone else. One question read, "What did character have in front of his house?" To which I responded, "A charming picket fence." I got credit for that question. The answer is actually that he had the heads of his slaughtered enemies on stakes. So, charming picket fence. The class was reviewing for a test on the American Revolution, and I was quizzing them about the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain signed the treaty with. Anybody? Jacob, he was daydreaming. Great Britain signed the treaty with. And Jacob said, "A pen?" Someone in my class had a pretty big argument with a teacher during German. We had to write a letter as a response to another letter, but most of the score was from grammar and syntax, and a minimum number of words, and only like 10% was about the actual coherent response to the content. So one of my classmates realized this and just verbatim answered the letter with the exact same letter, arguing that since it contained no wrong grammar and was perfect German, he should get all points except for content, while the teacher obviously considered it a massive perversion and wanted to just give him 0 points. Had an autistic kid who was very clear about her comfort zones. She got this question in her math book: "What would you do if you had $5 at the amusement park?" Go home. This answer at the same time spoke volumes about her, but it's also so relatable. Still cracks me up whenever I'm feeling down. Not a teacher, but in 4th grade I was told to say what fraction of the circle was shaded. The circle was split into fourths, 2 of which shaded. I answered 1/2 of the circle was shaded, while the teacher wanted 2/4. I wasn't given credit and was told I was incorrect. Later the teacher pulled me aside for confusing the other students. Not a teacher, but when I was in history class once I got an extra credit question on a quiz on list 3 alternative names for World War I. I answered the Great War, the war to end all wars, and the war, figuring that every war is at first called the war before it's gone on long enough to get a proper name. The teacher decided to give me credit for that. One of my classmates was rather salty about it since he had more realistic answers but could only come up with 2. Not a teacher, but a parent. My son was being tested for the special needs program, and they were asking him some logic questions. They asked him what he does if he drops his fork on the ground, expecting him to say pick it up. Instead he said he would get a new fork because he didn't want to eat with a dirty one. They asked what he would do if he walked into a room and the light was off, thinking he would say turn the light on. He said he would leave the room, because at that time he wasn't tall enough to reach the light switches. My other kid was in a storytime circle at preschool, and they were reading a book about this kid who does shit he's not supposed to, and at one point the kid is splashing water out of the bathtub. The teacher asks what happens, and most of the kids say the kid gets in trouble, he makes a big mess, but my kid says the floor gets cleaned. My school went through a period where they decided to make everyone do writing prompts regularly. It was annoying and fairly pointless. So when presented with one such prompt, a friend of mine dutifully answered the question, but written upside down and backwards so that it could only be read in a mirror. I think he was suspended for the stunt. In college teaching English, we read Hills Like White Elephants. Guy says it's about breast implants and gives an impassioned and textually supported defense. I liked his read better than the usual. Way back when I was a kid in high school, we had to write a book report on some yawn-inducing fictional World War II book. So I wrote a brief summary of why it was rubbish. Then wrote a long report on a totally different World War II book that was a ripping yarn for a 14-year-old, Sven Hassel's Monte Cassino, and why this book should have been the one we had to read. The historical setting. Importance of the battle. The combatants and the view from the opposing side. Even if mostly fictional, the note from the teacher mentioned that even though I wrote about a different book, he couldn't fault my reasoning, and my report on the second book was very well done. So he gave me an A. Once on a stats test, one of the questions started with, "Is it possible for?" And I wrote, "Anything is possible through God." And my teacher set up a one-on-one meeting to explain to me why she wasn't giving me credit, making sure I wasn't offended, and apologizing because I was technically correct. Personally, I don't believe in God, so it was a pretty funny outcome to me. Somewhat related to this, but when I was in high school, we had to do some essay exam about a book that I hadn't read. Instead of trying to bullshit my answer, I wrote an essay about another book I had read instead. I expected to get an F, but was surprised when I got it back and it was a B. He told me that it was a good essay, even if it wasn't about the assigned book, but to not do that again. Obligatory, not a teacher but. My elementary science teacher had an exercise that was meant to teach students the value of writing clear procedures by asking every kid in the class to write instructions for how to make a butter and jelly sandwich. As she collected papers, she tried to return one kid's paper, and then seemed to change her mind. She took the papers to the front of the classroom, and proceeds to misinterpret each kid's set of instructions, ultimately not making a correct sandwich. Finally, she gets to the kid whose paper she tried to return. It turned out that the kid had beaten her at her own game. The kid's instructions spelled out a perfectly clear instructions for a butter and jelly sandwich between 2 sticks of butter. The teacher had never said that a sandwich had to have bread. In hindsight, the activity was an enormous waste of food. Was teaching on the mandate of heaven. Wanted to make sure they understood what a mandate is. So I posed the question, can anyone define mandate? Slightly autistic kid raises hand and says it's when 2 men go on a date. Depending on how you look at it, sure. This is Guam, which, like a lot of Pacific islands introduced to Western diets, has an obesity problem. My friend taught visiting Korean students English at the local university. She asked them to come into class with something that represented Guam culture. One of the kids brought a pamphlet on diabetes.